In the 11th stanza of the 5th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, for purification of the ego, yogis merely work with the body, mind, and discrimination and sense organs. They are never attached to them. It's very important because what, you see, as I've said before, God is center everywhere, circumference nowhere. So your reality is right here where you are. And if you think of that reality as your body and your ego, then you will be caught in that. It's very important to understand how to get rid of that. And yoga teaches you that too, that the heart feeling where all the bondage really is, as Patanjali said, yogas chitta vritti nirodha, when you can get rid of the fluctuations or literally the vrittis, the whirlpools of feeling, then you achieve yoga. Well, what we need to do then is turn all those, there are many little vrittis, many little whirlpools. I want fame, I want pleasure, I want success, I want money. All these things are little vrittis. But there's a mahavritti, you could say, the thought of ego itself. And that thought of ego is centered here in the Medulla. Your actual soul center is the heart. As Yogananda said in Autobiography of a Yogi, I cognize the center of this empyrean, the state of Samadhi, as a point of intuitive perception in my heart. But that energy rising, it must remove the block of ego. This is why in all cultures the sign of humility is a bow, isn't it? The basic reason for that being a spiritual gesture, a gesture of humility, is that what you're doing in bowing is releasing the tension here at the medulla oblongata. This is actually the seat of your physical ego, your physical consciousness. When the sperm and ovum meet to create the physical body, they begin to subdivide from that point and gradually create the body. But when you think of your knee, you think of it as down there, don't you? Your elbow or your shoulder is here. You're always looking at it from this point, and you animate, you energize everything you do from this point. Well, the difference between the yogi and the worldly person, the egotist, is that the yogi has learned to remove that block of I consciousness, and that energy flows through the ego, through the medulla oblongata, to this point between the eyebrows. An enlightened person, well, I should say an egotistical person, everything he does emanates from this point. So he's very proud, looking down his nose, etc. But a yogi, when you become enlightened, you actually feel your center here. And it's a very freeing state because then you don't feel identified with this body. You have to keep it going. You have to know where to put your fork, I could put it that way, when you're eating. But everything is emanating. This is your center then. So what Krishna is saying here can be explained in a very literal way also. The yogi doesn't feel he is doing it. That is, he is an individual. But he feels everything is somehow, I can't explain it, but I know it. That the experience that comes is that you feel that this is where your center is. And everything is done directed from that point. So Krishna says that he doesn't feel himself, he is doing these things, he merely works with these things. Just as when you're eating, you use a fork or a spoon. So it is in that state, you feel that you're working with your senses, with your body, with the organs of activity and so on. But you're not doing it yourself. It's coming through, it's coming from the infinite. In fact, you know it's coming from the infinite because your very consciousness is a part of the infinite. You are a part of the infinite consciousness of God. And he planted this thought of I in you for the simple reason that I is all there ever is. Two realities, as I've said before, and it's worth keeping in mind, science will never be able to duplicate. One is feeling of any kind, and the other is I consciousness. And in fact, you can't even separate the two, because it takes an I to have that feeling, and it takes feeling to have the sense of I. The difference between the four aspects of mind is another interesting point. Mon, buddhi, ahankar, chitta. This is the aspect of mind, that part. This is why Dhritarashtra in the Mahabharata is described as blind. Because the mind is that part of your consciousness which receives impressions but doesn't define and doesn't put to use. It's just the receiver. But the subtlety of Indian philosophy is it explains even these subtle differences. So the mind is centered here. Then buddhi is centered at the point between the eyebrows. And when you try to understand something deeply, you sort of, what did you say? What do you mean? What do you mean by that? You knit your eyebrows. In fact, I don't know if I've told this story here before, but it's a very funny one, interesting. There was a dog near our Guru's retreat in 29 Palms in California. And this dog, he belonged to a neighbor. But one day we were eating outdoors and the dog came over. He sniffed the food. And my Guru said, look at him. He's so concentrated on the food, his whole consciousness is becoming focused here, straining toward it this way. And you could see the dog there was this sort of strain here. These truths are true in every way. The thing is, until you reach the vertebral level, it's hard to differentiate them. You don't know where the head of a worm is. You cut it in half and it becomes two worms. But as you come up to the vertebral level, you develop this. But still, you have to raise the energy from that. An animal has a tail. And when it's happy, it wags its tail. And when it's unhappy, it droops its tail and so on. All the energy in the lower animals goes downward. And the more you become enlightened, the more that energy rises. But you will see that in a worldly person, a sensual person, his energy's down here. And as he rises, you see it. And even in his expression, you see a rising energy there. Well, the more you can reach the point where you're centered here, and you're feeling that your activities are generated from this point, the more you find that you are working with the body, not just, you see that it's only a tool, just as I said, as a fork or a spoon are tools with which you eat. So this body and the senses and so on, you understand that they're your tools for functioning in this world. And I've told you this, really to me it was fascinating. When my Guru was writing his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, which I'm transmitting to you, but when I had read this, I said, Master, this is the greatest book I have ever read. And he said it's because it came from God. He didn't use his intellect. I watched him dictating, and he would just turn his mind, his eyes up here, go into superconsciousness, and his secretary, Dorothy Taylor, typed out what he was saying. He just spoke from that consciousness. So it was without any interference of the mind even. But when during breaks between when I was editing with him, because he had me editing it, or when he was dictating, and he would take a walk in the afternoon, late afternoon, and I would be sort of walking with him, and he would have his hand on me. And sometimes he sort of swayed and almost would fall. I would have to sort of hold him to keep him from falling. And I remember one time he said, I'm in all bodies. I hardly know which body I'm supposed to keep moving. And in his poem, Samadhi, it's a wonderful thing he said, I, the cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me. Wonderful thought. You know where he wrote that great poem? To me, it's the greatest poem in mystical literature that I've ever read, because it describes a state of union. When Ramakrishna, I'm not comparing them in greatness, because everybody who is one with God is equal. Nonetheless, when Ramakrishna described higher and higher states, finally he couldn't speak. When Saint Teresa of Avila reached her fourth stage of meditation, she said the mind can't think. And you do in your deep meditation. When you go deep enough, you go beyond the mind. So the fact that Master was able, by willpower, deliberate willpower, to bring that high perception down to this human level, that was really a much greater miracle than most people know. But he asked us one day, do you know where I wrote that poem? And we, of course, said, well, where? He said, on the subway in New York City. I can't imagine a more worldly environment than that subway. But he went from end to end of the line. He said, nobody disturbed me. In fact, he said with a sort of impish grin, nobody even saw me. So what he had done was sort of weave you might say, a protective barrier around him of invisibility. And so also when Sri Yukteswar came to Larry Mahashai one time, and Larry Mahashai said, didn't you see Babaji here? Babaji was there, but he said you weren't able to see me through the sunbeams. Invisibility is something that a master can have. And he creates this aura of invisibility. When Master had this experience when he was a young man, Master Mahashaya, great disciple of Ramakrishna and the author of the Gospel of Ramakrishna, he touched Master. It was a lovely story, in fact. What they had done, he had taken him to what he called a bioscope, which was a slideshow, and this professor's voice was very strident, and he was giving a very boring lecture. And Master Mahashai said to young Mukunda, you're not enjoying this, are you? And he said, sir, it's a very dry lecture. He said, well, I think you may enjoy this bioscope. And he touched him, or here, I forget which. And suddenly, Master became completely still and entered a state of superconsciousness. And the interesting thing he said was that many students he knew, passed him walking away. They looked right at him and they couldn't see him. And another interesting thing about it was that even if they didn't see him, they didn't walk into him. In that aura, that cloak of invisibility, there was also a protective cloak that people wouldn't enter that space. Well, this world's very different from what it appears to our senses. But the thing is that then, in that Samadhi, he was able, even in that very worldly environment, you don't know what a great miracle it was that he performed in writing that great poem. He said to us, memorize this poem and repeat it, recite it every night. And this is what my Naya Swami order, which I have created recently, what it is Samadhi oriented. It makes people think in terms of freedom from the ego, not of getting rid of things that bind you to matter. And it's an interesting thing too, the orange of the normal orange of the Swami. You know when you're on the highway and you see highway workers there, highway workers want cars to see them so they won't be struck. And so what color do they wear? Orange. Orange is a color that calls attention to yourself. And I must admit that I have met many very arrogant Swamis. They have not impressed me. Humility is the quality that is most important to develop. Not self-abasement, but realizing that he is the instrument through me. These things couldn't be taught in Shankaracharya's day, because people then, that was Kali Yuga. They didn't know that matter is energy. They didn't know that everything is basically one. They didn't know that we are just like little flames on a stove, but our reality is, the reality of that flame is the gas underneath it. And you can put different chemical powders on those gas flames, and each one will seem very individual, but it will still be that gas. People didn't know those things. He couldn't justify them. So he had to talk in terms of not wanting this, not wanting that, neti, renouncing things individually. But the vortex at the center of it all is ego. And he couldn't talk about that. But this Naya Swami order insists that we not dwell on this ego, that we try to efface this sense of self, not in a negative way, but in an embracing way, samadhi-oriented. So when Yogananda wrote, I, the cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me, he had to have some ego, or he wouldn't have, as I put it before, he wouldn't have known where to put his fork or his spoon when he was eating. But he didn't have that sense that bound him. So every master, certainly there has to be enough ego to keep those atoms together. but that isn't his true self. You must come to that point in your own evolution where you don't feel that you are doing these things. Don't feel that you, through the body, that the body is you doing it. And as long as you have your consciousness here, it will be in that aspect of your reality which created the body, beginning with the sperm and ovum and gradually going down the spine, going into the brain, going out to the afferent and efferent nerves to the body. And then, what chance do people have? They have to create this body. Then they have to sustain this body. Then they have to exercise this body. Then they have to educate this body. They're forced to think of this body as their reality. God doesn't make it easy. We have to reach the point where we know that that isn't our reality. It's really quite a leela, isn't it? And yet, when you understand that these are just the organs of senses, they're not what you're doing. You are working with them as a farmer uses a spade to dig in the soil. So your inner self uses the spade of his body to function in this world. But he knows that that is not his body. The more you can feel that freedom in yourself from the body, the more you know, Aham Brahmasmi, I am he. It is not difficult once you get a hold of these sort of key points. And yet it is difficult because it does take time, and so many things keep reminding you. I know of one highly advanced disciple who still had an attachment to money, and he will have to overcome it. And this is why the Guru has to be with you many lifetimes. But it doesn't have to be. And why let it be? Why not say, right now I'm free? And this is what the Gita is trying to tell us. Joy to you.